I'm really happy to be here. Some of us have been at a number of these Stegner events this past year, and it's always a little disconcerting how many gray hairs there are in the audience. And along with Bob Steensma, I'm here to attest that Wallace Stegner has a couple new generations of fans as well. I want to start with two quotes. One is the one that Bob talked about so much. It is "The love of books, I owe them," Stegner's essay about his teachers. And then a quote from Stegner: "A teacher enlarges people in all sorts of ways besides just his subject matter." Although Stegner described himself as becoming a teacher accidentally, we have ample evidence that he was a great teacher. Today I want to talk not so much about how I teach Stegner, but how I use Stegner as a teacher in my own classrooms. Stegner quotes often appear on my syllabi or handouts. Oops. Especially the next two, which I find essential to any discussion of gender in Western literature and history. From near the end of Big Rock Candy Mountain. And I'm a literature teacher. I need to put the quotes in front of you. "Perhaps it took several generations to make a man. Perhaps it took several combinations and recreations of his mother's gentleness and resilience, his father's enormous energy and appetite for the new, a subtle blending of masculine and feminine, selfish and selfless, stubborn and yielding, before a proper man could be fashioned." That's a quote about a personal synthesis. The next one is about a cultural synthesis. In a way, the dichotomy between the past and present is a product of two forces frequently encountered in both Western fiction and the Western: the freedom-loving, roving man and the civilizing woman. Given the circumstances of Western settlement and the legitimate inclinations of the sexes, and I bolded that because I'm coming back to it, it was natural that the West should find this theme strong in its history and make it into something pervasive in its literature. It is inescapable. Long before I heard this theme stated and before I knew enough Western literature to state it myself, I had put it into Bo and Elsa Mason in the Big Rock Candy Mountain. Almost every writer who has dealt with family stresses on the frontier has probably found it in his own hands, because he probably grew up with it in his own family. Male freedom and aspiration versus female domesticity, wilderness versus civilization, violence and danger versus the safe and the tamed. Now, on their face, these quotes might seem to belie Stegner's frequent assertion that the West does not need to explore its myths much further. It has already relied upon them for too long. For these are certainly familiar, perhaps even seemingly stereotypic or mythic descriptions of gender roles. But it's first important to note that at a time when Western women were represented as opponents to male freedom, the Aunt Pollys who make Huck wear shoes and go to school, the brides who come to Yellow Sky and ruin everything, Stegner declares that women's inclinations are as legitimate as men's. And if we think about that quote that's been used so often here in the last couple of days about privileging cooperation over rugged individualism, we might say that he often even preferred female values. And what interests me in these quotes is how Stegner frequently establishes a dialogic opposition in order to move beyond it to a synthesis. I think of the passage Patty Limerick quoted, an embracing of incompatibilities. I argue that Stegner represents Western history as an often conflicted but inescapable marriage between these opposed and sometimes gendered forces, perhaps a not so subtle blending. And I'll come back to that point later. Today I'd like to describe two assignments in which Stegner serves as an exemplary model for my students of what I hope for from them. I'll begin with a graduate class, which seems appropriate since Stegner, at least in his later years, was most celebrated for teaching graduate creative writing courses. And then I'll turn to an undergraduate class. A few hundred pages into Angle of Repose, Lyman Ward's son urges him to write about Deadwood, a setting he feels will add zing to his book, asking, why leave out the colorful stuff? But Lyman, award-winning historian and narrator of the novel, is disinterested in the riotous Deadwood with its motley mythic cast. And one might wonder what he thinks of one of my favorite TV shows these days, David Milch's Deadwood. I don't give a damn if grandfather once saw Wild Bill playing, he rejoins. I'm much more interested in quirky little things that most people wouldn't even notice. And that's where the title for my talk comes from. After taking my introduction to the theory and practice of American Studies graduate seminar, my graduate students use the phrase quirky little things as if it's a universally cited critical concept. So, something like we the people, the legacy of conquest, or the mad woman in the attic. Lyman says of his grandmother's Leadville cabin in 1879, there assembled an extraordinary collection of education, culture, talent, eloquence, reputation, political power, and intellectual force. My students come to recognize that he might also be describing Angle of Repose, which gathers a far larger collection of literary and historical figures and facts into a cultural history of the early U.S. West, written by two scholars in the interdisciplinary American Studies tradition, Lyman and Stegner. Or he might be describing other Stegner works, particularly his biographies and nonfiction. Page Stegner has commented that when his father, quote, created Bernard DeVoto's life, he created his own. And Stegner might be reflecting on much of his own work when he suggests that if DeVoto, quote, were to put a single label on what he had written in the Easy Chair, he would call it cultural criticism and insist that no manifestation of American life is trivial to the critic of culture, nor is any quirky little thing. Angle of Repose can certainly be read as a fictional biography, based as it is on the life and letters of Mary Halleck Foote. And Stegner's 4 biographies, as well as many of his other writings, are similarly genre-crossing. As much cultural history as biography, their interdisciplinary methodology instructive to contemporary critics. While Stegner's reading willingness to read town dumps, folk songs, river canyons, illustrations, geological surveys and drawings, paintings, and personal letters as texts, as primary documents, anticipates current scholarship. Kurt Meine has even called Stegner a, quote, geobiographer, who explores, and this is a quote, the relationship between biographical subject and biogeographical space, using this relationship to examine forces, tensions, patterns, and themes at the heart of North America's cultural development. In The Uneasy Chair, Stegner praises DeVoto for his innovative narrative style, particularly demonstrated in The Year of Decision, 1846, which is a book about one single year. And here's what he says. He writes, history by synecdoche, the concentration of large events and movements of population and clashes of attitude and interest within the single sharp focus of a symbolic action or restricted period of time. I suggest that Stegner borrowed and adapted from his friend to write cultural biography. He frequently commented that he was not particularly interested in the personal lives of DeVoto or Powell, though he certainly was in Mary Halleck Foote's personal life. Instead of concentrating on action or time, he focuses on a single crucial figure, such as Mary Halleck Foote, who serves as a magnet, drawing together cultural, geographical, and public forces and events. As DeVoto himself wrote about Beyond the 100th Meridian, Mr. Stegner's subject is 19th century America and the part the West played in creating 20th century America. Dan Flores, the environmental historian, calls the book a history of ideas of the West. There are no better examples of anthropologist Clifford Geertz's influential concept of thick description than Stegner's cultural histories, and I'll come back to what that is in a minute. Through reading Angle of Repose as thick description, my students develop a valuable methodology. As a literary critic, I might even term it a theoretical framework. Through learning to borrow Lyman's interest in quirky little things, an interest certainly shared by his creator, who wrote, "The fiction writer is an incorrigible lover of concrete things." And Lynn was talking about this too. Here's a quote from one of my students, Allison Jones. "For years, I tried to explain my field of study through statements such as, American studies is an interdisciplinary view of history. For example, I love learning about how literature," and Allison read it this way, "say Uncle Tom's Cabin has shaped history or how a piece of art reflects a political movement. Such a statement quickly grew old and never quite encapsulated my fascination. My interest finally found articulation in Stegner's Quirky Little Details. As I researched my assigned details, my readings and writings gained depth. A single method of mention of Mary Cassatt in the middle of Angle of Repose led to an examination that enriched my understanding of and appreciation for the character of Susan Burling Ward. A study of the West Cure, which is a play on the rest cure, enhanced my knowledge of Owen Wister and the cast of The Virginian. Researching Alice Fletcher and the Dawes Act augmented my reading of Darcy McNichol's Wind from an Enemy Sky. And so it continues. Each detail, no matter how quirky or little, adds vibrancy to my studies, my writings, and my understandings of humanity. So within the first week of class, I give my students a list of cultural and historical figures, events, institutions, movements mentioned in Angle, some only once, the painter Mary Cassatt, for instance, or even twice, Little Women author Louisa May Alcott, and I've put a few of these lists up on the screen, and there will be more coming. Some are recurrent, the picturesque, the geological surveys, the Hudson River School of Painters, and I've learned that I have to say Hudson River School of Painters because I once had a student go out and try to find a physical school called the Hudson River School. Kind of like, and there are physical schools in Angle, Cooper Union, which Susan Burling Ward attends, or MIT. Some are well known, Henry James, others little known today, railroad magnate Henry Villard. Some establish a theme, the group of scientists and engineers who intersect with the Wards' lives. Some occur only off stage, such as the Chinese miners who work at New Almaden but who are never seen, or the Potosi mine in Bolivia, where Oliver hopes to but never works, and which I learned from a student report was not only the highest, at somewhat over 11,000 feet, but also one of the world's largest cities by 1672. And that's a quirky little detail. So I assign each student one quirky little detail of their choice to discuss in a paper and oral presentation, no more than 10 or 15 minutes long. As Allison's comment suggests, this assignment becomes a kind of template for later assignments as the students continue to do oral presentations on quirky details that help us understand other texts, sometimes histories, sometimes essays, sometimes paintings or photographs in richer cultural contexts. Okay, Mr. Tech Man, can you put me up now? Oh, there I am. It's a little scary. Then we talk about Geertz's The Interpretations of Cultures, and I'll just give you a brief sense of Geertz's key relevant point, and I needed to be up there because I'm not sure you're going to be able to see what I'm doing here. Geertz talks about the blink and the wink, and so what I'm doing right now is my eye is closing and then opening again. And with this assignment, I play with my students a little bit, and I would do it if I could move away from the stage, but I call up a man, and I say, okay, we're walking down the street, and I walk past you, and what does that mean? And the class comes up with, it generates a number of possible meanings. Then I call up a woman student, and in fact, I believe I did this with my student Melinda, who is going to speak to us later, and I walk past her, and I do this. And then I suggested to one student I'd talk to Philip before class. And I said, Philip, I've had you in class before, and I really want you in class. We go into the classroom, there are 50 too many students. So I say to the class, oh, I'm so sorry, but if you're not pre-registered, and Philip isn't, I'm not going to let you in the class. And then I wink at Philip. And then I ask people if there's anybody in the class who has contact lenses. And those of you who have them know that this means something really different if you have contact lenses. So, what Geertz talks about is the fact that there's a difference between a blink, which is a physiological, physical action, and a wink. And that difference is cultural context. So a thin description would just describe what physically happened. As in my line, my eye is now closing and opening again. And notice that I put it into the passive so that there was no agency involved. Whereas a thick description attempts to describe the full cultural context in which actions or historical figures or writers or artists or events or places or photographs acquire meaning. As we turn to Angle, I want my students first to recognize, as I suggested before, that what an exemplary thick description looks like, and I think Angle of Repose is one. Then to fully internalize what should be absolutely obvious, that the most important quality that they can develop as scholars is that intense curiosity and attention to detail, captured in the phrase, quirky little things that most people wouldn't even notice. This quality is at the heart of interdisciplinary scholarship, and Stegner is an exemplar. Their challenge is to offer their classmates a thicker description of their particular detail, that Potosi was the biggest city in 1672 in the New World, which in turn allows for a focused interpretation based on historical research. Their detail acquires meaning within the cultural context of the novel, but at the same time, more information about their detail opens doors into the novels or essays or photographs' hidden rooms, into its motifs, themes, and meanings. Let me develop just one example from my own work. My assigned detail is an 1885 issue of Century magazine, mentioned only once in Angle of Repose. Century, as most of you know, is one of the most influential cultural media in the late 19th century US. Although Lyman's portrayal of Thomas Hudson, longtime friend of Susan Ward and editor of Century magazine, is ambivalent, fraught with the Western male's attitudes about effete intellectuals in the Eastern literary establishment, he respects Hudson's role as an editor, saying, "I wouldn't be surprised if he found and published 2/3 of the best literature in 4 decades." One of those writers, of course, is Susan Ward, and Hudson puts her in good company. One of her stories appears in an 1885 issue of Century, which includes installments of Twain's The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, William Dean Howells's The Rise of Silas Lapham, and James's The Bostonians. And some of you heard Patty Limerick talk about Howells yesterday. I was really interested in this connection. And she and I are of a certain age, and I also own the book on realism that she talked about yesterday. In it, Stegner reprinted a story of Mary Hallock Foote's. He was the first modern editor to reprint a Mary Hallock Foote story. In what might appear to be an extraneous detail, Stegner points out that the issue contains chapters 9 and 10 of Silas Lapham. Yet, like many of Stegner's cultural facts, the detail validates Lyman's interest in quirky little things and sets up an implicit conversation between and about books. Silas Lapham is about class in the Gilded Age. A smart but uneducated farm boy from New England, Silas, becomes a self-made millionaire and struggles to make sense of civilized society. Chapter 9 explores the role of reading in U.S. society, a major theme in Angle of Repose. In this chapter, the upper-class Tom Corey advises Silas's daughter, Irene, which books to buy for the library in her family's elegant new brownstone. And the celebrated authors he suggests to her are, most of them appear in Angle of Repose. Irene, like her father, is less concerned with the authors than with their elegant bindings. But her sister Penelope, a reader, expresses a view of George Eliot that parallels Oliver Ward's in a literary debate with his wife, and also echoes The Virginian, if any of you have read that novel lately. I wish George Eliot would let you find out a little about the people for yourself. At the chapter's end, Tom and his Brahmin father discuss habits of reading among the civilized and the, quote, non-cultivated. Later in the novel, the book theme appears when Howells examines the influence of a best-selling sentimental novel, Tears, Idle Tears, called Slop, Silly Slop, by Tom's ironical sister, on the actions of various characters. Ever practical, Silas reads newspapers, and Howells recognizes the different kind of cultural work done by newspapers, books, and magazines such as Century. He was, after all, the editor of Harper's Monthly for many years, even if his hero sees books largely as interior design. Serving a similar function as satiric props in Twain's Grangerford House, books and book learning are also major themes throughout Huckleberry Finn. Tom Sawyer is clearly a victim and a carrier of what Twain called the Sir Walter Scott disease. That is, an obsession with romantic plots and language. Lyman reads Scott with his grandmother but escapes infection. Twain often associates books with gentility, with hypocrisy, with efforts to exert power over others. And time and again, he exposes characters unable to escape the kind of about used up language, romantic language that Oliver points out in some of Susan's descriptions, or other false literary inheritances. And a parenthetical here. Writing about his childhood, Stegner said, quote, "Almost everything I got from books was either at odds with what I knew from experience, or irrelevant to it, or remote from it." Both The Rise of Silas Lapham and Huckleberry Finn show us characters wrestling with the influence books have on their lives. Both novels explore the struggle between romance and realism in U.S. culture, one of our most significant literary themes. Stegner recognizes that Susan has a voice in this conversation, and as he recognized that Mary Halleck Foote had a voice in that conversation by reprinting her story. Hudson, who decides to make Susan his Western correspondent and to publish her work along with these great novels, values her attempts to bring together romance and realism, to write, quote, "In her key of aspiration arising out of homely realism in a spirit of discovery about the West." Susan will carry not only books, but also the great literary and intellectual debates of her time into the West. In many subtle ways, such as his reference to Chapter 9, Stegner explores the conflicts and the interdependence between the two dominant literary movements of the late 19th century, and suggests that Western literature, Western American literature, evolves from the marriage of these two points of view and style. In fact, Stegner marries them. Lyman continues his grandmother's project when he realizes what he's really exploring in his book: a marriage, a masculine and a feminine, a romantic and a realist. And notice that the masculine is lined up with the romantic and the feminine with the realist. And I would claim that that's exactly what happens with Oliver and Susan in the book. Think back here to my discussion of Stegner's effort at the beginning to synthesize, to offer us dialogic conversations. Devoto once said, "I distrust absolutes. Rather, I long ago passed from distrust of them to opposition. And with them, let me include prophecy, simplification, generalization, abstract logic, and especially the habit of mind which consults theory first and experience only afterward." I think Stegner shared Devoto's view, and so do I. What I've just demonstrated is an assignment based on inductive reasoning, building from close reading, curiosity, and careful research. One of the quickest ways to paralyze even a graduate student would be an assignment to write about romance and realism as a theme in a novel. Notice and start with quirky little things instead. Stegner even seems to suggest that this is the way culture is created. This is one of my favorite quotes from Stegner. "Culture is a pyramid to which each of us brings a stone." I've always thought that his pyramid is really a Western cairn, Stegner leading the way. Writing that, quote, "At its best, literature is a bolt of lightning from me to you, a flash of recognition, and a feeling within the context of a shared culture. He shows my students how to read within a shared cultural context." And here's a comment from my student, Melinda Rich. And if the guy with the microphone could take Melinda the microphone. Thank you, she's right, thank you. Melinda, on stage.
Our focus on the quirky things in Stegner's angle of repose broadened my appreciation and awareness of the level of insight Stegner had gained about the intermingling cultural, historical, literary, national, economic, and social context present in the differing timeframes portrayed in his work. The fact that we could present a 15-minute paper on just one of these details shows me that American Studies is a discipline that centers on connecting the sometimes differing academic perspectives together to create a larger framework of knowledge. Those connections, to me, show Stegner's skill as a writer, but also his strength as a scholar. I may never be a Stegner, but I can follow his example and seek to piece together the quirky little things that make up our American experience. Thank you.
I've been giving this assignment for about 20 years, maybe. About 10 years ago, one of my students carried it with her to graduate school at the University of New Mexico, where she convinced the first-year writing committee to adopt it. Every first-year student at University of New Mexico was required to read Angle of Repose and write papers on quirky little things as a way of initiating them into how to do scholarly research. But most of those students will not become scholars. And what I really hope they took away from their writing about Angle of Repose is that insatiable sense of curiosity about our culture and history that will keep them reading. Let me turn to an assignment I'm actually using this semester to illustrate how Stegner can be used in an undergraduate class. Stegner's advocacy for conservation and other issues is well known and has been much discussed here. He admired Powell as the, quote, personification of an ideal of public service, end quote, and Devoto for taking on causes, for being what we would now call a public intellectual. Devoto, he said, and this is a quote, galvanized him the moment he showed signs of being an activist. Writing of Stegner's Wilderness Letter of 1960, Dan Flores echoes Stegner, calling it a worldwide classic of environmental history, a galvanizing document. I'm now teaching a class in U.S. nature writers who I hope will be galvanized by reading the letter, as students have been in the past. And I'm really glad that Terry read a little bit of it this morning, because I cut that out to stay within my time. Stegner embodies the importance of turning words into deeds. And when I wrote that line, I didn't realize it was Frost's until I heard Terry this morning. We'll talk about the coalition between Stegner and David Brower of the Sierra Club, which led to the book Terry talked about, This is Dinosaur, distributed to all members of Congress as a lobbying tool to prevent the dam from flooding the canyon, serving as a template for later books such as Stephen Trimble's and Terry's testimony, also distributed to congressional members. In his actions, as well as in passages like the following one, Stegner illuminated for the next generation what he saw as the responsibility of the writer. He was writing to a correspondent. You speak of the writer's involvement in his society. I think many writers are far too little involved. They sit in the middle of their own skulls or their own endocrines and snipe at the saints, politicians, working people, housewives, and bureaucrats who have to keep the world running. This doesn't mean I'm anti-literary. The highest thing I can think of doing is literary. But literature does not exist in a vacuum. We are neither detached nor semi-detached, but are linked to the world by a million interdependencies. To deny the interdependencies while living on the comforts and services that they make possible is adolescent, when it isn't downright dishonest. After reading Stegner's Wilderness Letter and discussing its influence and how it laid the groundwork for his work with Udall at the Department of the Interior and numerous conservation successes, and now I think I'll assign them to watch Terry's talk this morning on the website as well, my students will write a letter themselves about a social or political or cultural issue they care strongly about to a real person or agency or group who has some influence over their chosen topic. Then they must find an address and mail the letter. One day in class, they'll all read their letters aloud to each other, and we'll talk about the rhetorics of advocacy, about differences between polemics and persuasion, between Abbey and Stegner on Red Rock Country, and later we'll be getting to Terry Tempest Williams. In the past, students have written letters to county officials about the desecration of runoffs into Bear Lake, to the National Park Service about snowmobiles in Yellowstone, to whoever it is who disperses licenses to fish in the Logan River, which, believe me, they care very passionately about, to potential donors to a humane society, which we finally got in Cache Valley. I've read far too many rants on both sides of the hunting issue, and we talk about the implications of rants as well. As they listen to each other, I'll ask them to think about another of Stegner's recurring concerns, quote, the bonds that make individuals into a society. And sometimes they get answers before the end of the term, and we can talk about those too. Of course, I tell my students I don't really care what they write about, what position they take, when in fact I profoundly do. But this assignment reaches beyond environmentalism. I want to train students to be insightful, lifelong readers. It is the love of books I owe them. But I also think it's my responsibility, especially at a public land-grant university, to encourage them to become good citizens. Responsibility. Now, that's one of Stegner's favorite words. I'm quite sure that what I least like about some people is irresponsibility, he groused to Richard Etchelane. I don't give a damn what their morals are or anything else, but their irresponsibility to something larger than themselves, to some kind of social stability or common tradition and standard, does seem to me a kind of delinquency. My past, he says, quote, probably leads me to take a moralistic view of writing, to think of it not only as an art, but also as a kind of cultural function. I suppose I'm constantly trying to bear in mind that having been very lucky, I am also very responsible, and that the only thing that makes civilization go forward is the responsibility of individuals, whether gifted or otherwise, small or large. All of us have the obligation somehow to have some kind of concern for the species, for the culture, for the larger thing outside of ourselves. I'm sure that's buried not too deeply in most of the books I've written. That's a lesson I hope my students learn from reading Stegner. And the Wilderness Letter ends with that audacious phrase he used elsewhere as well, so often quoted, the geography of hope, which has such resonance today with Obama as president. Stegner, as we know, challenged the angst and despair and emptiness of so much late 20th century literature. He always showed that individual acts mattered, and he recognized that taking responsibility is a way of alleviating guilt, which can be paralyzing, as we know. I think it's important that he leaves today's young people with that message of hope. As with many things, Stegner, the university teacher, often ruminated, and that was another favorite word, about education. In Beyond the 100th Meridian, he relies on a repeated phrase, which Terry talked about this morning, to define what he sees as the source of the energy, curiosity, and independent thinking Powell and many of his colleagues brought to the West following the Civil War. Unlike the figures Stegner sets up as Powell's foils, the college-educated Henry Adams and Clarence King, those young scientists depended on, quote, homegrown educations and learned on the job. And yet Stegner saw his own working class Western boyhood and those of Devoto, Van Tilburg Clark, and others as, quote, culturally undernourished, deprived of, quote, the civilized tradition of books, ideas, poetry, history, philosophy, all the instruments and residue of human self-examination, which they rushed hungrily toward. That same cultural hunger he described in the letter Paige read yesterday to the woman in Roundup, Montana. I suppose that disdain for Adams and King with their elite educations and his desire for his own college education is another example of that embracing of incompatibilities. One of many reasons I value Stegner is that he describes my own Western childhood a generation or two later, and now those of some of my students, also first-generation college students. We bring our stones to his cairn. Thank you. Thanks. Yes?
When you make this assignment to write the letter, do you give them possible issues, or do you have the students come up with the issues themselves?
You know, I first gave this assignment when I taught for many years at the University of New Hampshire, and it was a different time and place, and I gave them, I often would suggest strongly partisan environmental issues. Now I pretty much let them come up with their own issues because I don't want them to think I'm telling them what to think. But we talk about possible issues in class, and the students generate ideas for issues.
Hi.
Hi, Tommy.
In Franklin's book, the biography, talks about how you use Mary Helen Foote's materials in your class. Could you explain that to everyone? I think it's as a creative and innovative of what you've been talking about now.
Yeah, thank you, Tommy. My shill. This is something I wanted to talk about and I couldn't fit in. It's true that he told me he was interested in that part of the book. I have taught Mary Helen Foote along with Angle of Repose for many, many years. And at first, I would teach Angle of Repose first, and the students would read it, and then I'd reveal to them later on that many of the letters, at least in the first two-thirds of the book, are actually Mary Helen Foote's words. I'd tell them about the changes in her life story that Stegner made, and I hope if most of you don't know about this, you should definitely read. You should definitely read Phil's book. And what I found was that my students got really pissed off when I taught it that way. They would get really mad at Stegner because they thought that the letters that he had written so convincingly in a woman's point of view, and they felt kind of duped that these words really belonged to a historical figure. And so then I started experimenting. And most recently what I've done far more often is I spend some time on Mary Hallock Foote before we read Angle of Repose. So we look at a lot of her illustrations. If you don't know them, you should go look at them. The Book of Reminiscences is a really wonderful book, which includes a lot of them. And we talk about a number of her stories that are summarized or dealt with in one way or another in Angle of Repose. And then we turn to Angle of Repose. And it's kind of like the quirky details that I just was talking about. Then the students are, rather than annoyed, intrigued by Stegner's use of historical materials and how he incorporates them into the novel and how he interprets and makes sense of them, because he does have a very strong interpretation of her life as well as fictionalizing some of her life. And so I suppose that now that I'm thinking of Patty's phrase, that's another coming together of incompatibilities. They look at these two different approaches and think about them. Yes?
Looking at those details, the assumption is made that each one of them Stegner thought deeply about and put in deliberately, and nothing was left to chance. And is there any trap or to research these little details and read into it more than he intended, or to make assumptions that aren't really true?
Did everybody hear that question? The question is there a trap in making too much of these details when he may or may not have intended them to have the significance that I'm finding them in? And the answer to that is I'm a literary critic. I mean, that's the standard, question, deep hidden meanings. Literary critics are always seeking out deep hidden meanings. And, a fiction writer will answer that, and I'm sure Stegner would answer the question far more deeply than I do. That's the glib answer. The more sophisticated answer, I think, is that Stegner loved detail. I would feel more threatened by that answer were I talking about another writer than Wallace Stegner. But I think he loved research and loved looking into details. But remember that the assignment is not just about Angle of Repose as well. It's not just about Wallace Stegner and Angle of Repose. It's looking at Angle of Repose as a kind of cultural document that tells us the history of that period. And so they're learning the history through the analysis of Angle of Repose.
This may be difficult, but I just read enough, and of course that was my introduction and my lifelong love of this man and author. But for the audience here, and maybe they all know, would you explain why he thought he had permission to use these letters?
Well, I'm sure Paige could do that way better than I could. I know all of Mary Hallock Foote's descendants. I've talked to the women that Stegner dealt with. I'm working on an edition of her letters with one of the great-granddaughters now. And I think it was a profound misunderstanding between the family and Stegner. I think it was done with the very best of intentions. I think the use of the word plagiarism is too strong a word, although I understand why people want to use that word. Having said that, as I understand it, and Paige or Lynn could correct me, Stegner had the impression that he was not supposed to identify these women or use the name of Mary Hallock Foote as in the beginning of the book. There's a short little thanks to Janet J.M. for the use of her ancestor. I would be happier with the book had Stegner had a preface where he talked about the fact that this was this wonderful writer who he admired so much and that he was using a lot of her language. For instance, the term Angle of Repose is hers. It's one that she used frequently, and I was listening to Phil use it yesterday and thinking about this. It's one that she used frequently in her writing, and she used it symbolically and metaphorically, just the same way that Stegner uses it symbolically and metaphorically. So I think if he were asked publicly, he would of course have given her that kind of credit. But I think it was a kind of misunderstanding that led him not to do that. But again, I don't want to speak. I never asked him about it. Okay, thank you.